I always thought I had it all figured out. My wife, Laura, was a constant. A dependable woman who managed everything at home while I climbed the corporate ladder. She was the one who made sure the house was spotless, the kids were cared for, and I could focus on my career without distractions. It was a seamless partnership, at least from where I stood. But looking back, I suppose that's where I went wrong, thinking it was a partnership, when really, it was all her holding things together. The day Laura found out about Sophie wasn't one I had planned for. To be fair, I never thought she'd find out at all. I wasn't exactly careful, but I wasn't reckless either. It was a random Tuesday, the kind of day you don't think will change your life forever. I'd stepped outside my office for a quick break, feeling the buzz of excitement that Sophie brought into my life. There she was, glamorous, confident, and so different from Laura in every way. Sophie walked up to me, kissed me on the lips like she had every right to, and I didn't stop her. I didn't even think about stopping her. I didn't see Laura in her car across the street. I didn't see her mouth fall open in shock or her hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. But I can't imagine it now, and it's not a picture I like to dwell on. That evening, when I came home, things felt off. Laura didn't greet me with her usual smile. She didn't ask about my day. She was busy tucking our youngest into bed, and when she came downstairs, there was this look on her face, calm, but not the good kind. I kissed her on the cheek out of habit, and she turned away. "What's wrong?" I asked, feigning ignorance. She didn't answer right away. She just stood there, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. Finally, she said, "Ryan, is there something you'd like to tell me?" Now, I've always been quick on my feet. I can talk my way out of most situations. But this wasn't a situation I was ready for. "Like what?" I asked, stalling for time. She didn't blink. "Today, purely by chance, I drove past your office. I saw you outside." I saw her. My stomach dropped. "She kissed you," Laura continued, her voice steady but her eyes glistening, "and you hugged her like she was your wife. Be honest, Ryan, do you have a mistress?" I thought about lying. It would have been so easy to deny everything, to tell her she was mistaken or that Sophie was just a colleague being overly friendly. But looking at Laura, I knew it wouldn't work. She wasn't angry yet, just hurt. "Yes," I said finally, the word hanging in the air like a grenade waiting to explode. I expected her to scream, to throw something, to storm out of the room. But she didn't. She just stood there, staring at me like she didn't recognize the man in front of her. "Her name's Sophie," I added, as if that made anything better. Laura laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that made my chest ache. "Sophie," she repeated, "and how long has this been going on?" "Not long," I lied. "And what exactly do you expect me to do with this information, Ryan? Pretend I didn't see anything? Carry on like nothing happened?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Laura, I don't want to change anything. You and the kids mean everything to me. Sophie is just—" I hesitated, searching for the right word. "Just what?" she demanded, her voice rising for the first time. I didn't have an answer that wouldn't make things worse. "You're a coward," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You traded us for some woman from work, and you don't even have the decency to feel guilty about it." She walked out of the kitchen then, leaving me standing there like an idiot. I should have gone after her, should have tried to fix things. But I didn't. I didn't know how. That night, we slept in separate rooms for the first time in our marriage. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. I didn't love Sophie, not really. She was exciting, sure, but she wasn't Laura. Laura was the mother of my children, the woman who'd stood by me through everything. But instead of appreciating her, I'd thrown it all away for a fleeting distraction. The next morning, I left the house early. I couldn't face her. Not yet. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Laura wasn't the type to let something like this slide. She'd fight back, and I'd have to be ready for whatever came next. If I thought Laura's calmness the night before was unsettling, I had no idea what I was in for next. She didn't shout, didn't cry in front of the kids, and didn't even slam a door. That would have been easier, I think. Her silence was worse. It was like she was gathering her strength, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And strike, she did. It wasn't immediate. I came home for the next few nights thinking maybe she'd simmer down. Maybe she'd just accept things as they were and focus on the kids, like she always did. I mean, that's what Laura was about, wasn't it? The kids, the house, stability. But then Sophie started pushing. "When are we moving in together, Ryan?" she asked one evening, her tone sharp. "I'm not going to raise this baby in my apartment like some kind of secret." I rubbed my temples, already tired of the conversation. "It's not that simple, Sophie. I can't just move out. There's the house, the kids." "The kids can live with us," she interrupted, her voice full of confidence. "I'll be a better mom to them than Laura ever was. And you know it." She didn't get it. Sophie didn't know Laura. She didn't know how she read bedtime stories to Ivy every night, or how she remembered every little thing about Miles, like how he hated peas but loved carrots. But Sophie wasn't interested in the truth. She was interested in her version of reality, where everything fit perfectly into her plan. A few days later, I made the worst mistake I've ever made in my life. I brought Sophie to the house. I told myself it was just a talk, to explain things to Laura face to face with Sophie there, so there wouldn't be any misunderstandings. In hindsight, it was pure cowardice. I thought having Sophie beside me would make me feel stronger, but it only made me look like a fool. When Laura opened the door and saw Sophie standing beside me, her expression didn't change. Not at first. She just stood there, staring at us like we were strangers. "What is this?" she asked, her voice low and even. "What are you doing, Ryan?" I cleared my throat, trying to sound calm. "Laura, I think it's time we talked about what happens next. Sophie is pregnant and—" "This is your plan?" Laura cut me off, her voice trembling now. "You bring her here, to my house, and expect me to, what? Hand over the keys? Pack up the kids and leave so the two of you can play house?" Sophie stepped forward, her chin raised. "Actually, that's exactly what we expect." I swear, the air in the room froze. I'd never seen Laura so still, so quiet. For a moment, I thought she was going to walk away. But then she laughed, a cold, sharp laugh that made my stomach churn. "Let me get this straight," she said, turning to me. "You think you're going to take my home, my children, and replace me with this?" Her eyes flicked to Sophie, who bristled under the scrutiny. "Watch your tone," Sophie snapped. "I'm carrying his child." Laura ignored her, her gaze fixed on me. "Ryan, do you have any idea what you're doing? Do you even care what this is going to do to Ivy and Miles?" I wanted to respond, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. I wasn't prepared for this confrontation. Sophie, on the other hand, had no such hesitation. "Your kids will be fine," she said dismissively. "They'll have me, and I'm more than capable of being a good mother." That's when Laura snapped. "Get out," she said, her voice low but deadly. "Both of you. Get out of my house." "Actually," Sophie began smugly, "this house is half Ryan's, which means it's half mine now." Laura didn't even blink. "Over my dead body." Sophie opened her mouth to retort, but I grabbed her arm. "Let's go," I muttered, dragging her toward the door. "We'll talk about this later." As we left, I glanced back at Laura. She was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face a mask of fury and pain. I should have apologized. I should have done something to fix the mess I'd made. But instead, I drove away with Sophie, leaving Laura to pick up the pieces of our shattered family. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd become this man. The kind of man who betrays his wife and humiliates her in her own home. But even as the guilt gnawed at me, a part of me clung to the idea that I could still control the situation, still come out on top. What I didn't realize was that Laura wasn't done. Not by a long shot. When Laura finally filed for divorce, I wasn't surprised, but I was furious. I thought I had made myself clear. I didn't want a divorce. I didn't care how angry or hurt she was. We had a family, a house, and a life that I wasn't ready to dismantle. But Laura? She wasn't listening. It started with a letter from her lawyer. When I saw it on the kitchen counter, I couldn't believe it. Divorce papers. My hands shook as I read through them, and I could feel the heat rising in my chest. She wasn't just leaving me. She was coming for everything. The house, the kids. She wanted it all. I confronted her that evening when she came back from picking up Ivy and Miles. She walked in like nothing had changed, like she hadn't just declared war on me. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, holding up the papers. Laura didn't flinch. She just set her purse down and looked at me with that maddening calm. "It's exactly what it looks like, Ryan. I'm filing for divorce." "I told you I don't want a divorce," I shouted. "We can work through this, Laura. For the kids. For us." "For us?" she echoed, her voice laced with disbelief. "Ryan, there is no us anymore. You ended that the moment you brought Sophie into our lives. This isn't about you wanting to work things out. It's about you wanting to control the situation, like you always do." "That's not fair," I snapped, though I knew deep down she was right. "You're blowing this way out of proportion. I don't see why we can't just keep things the way they are." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "The way they are? You mean you with your mistress and me raising our kids like nothing happened? Absolutely not. This is over, Ryan. You need to accept that." I didn't accept it. I refused. And if Laura wanted a fight, then fine. I was ready to give her one. The next day, I called my lawyer, Mark. Mark was the kind of guy you hired when you wanted to win, no matter the cost. I laid everything out for him, from Laura's filing to her demands. He listened, nodding thoughtfully before leaning back in his chair. "Well, Ryan," he said finally, "this isn't going to be easy. She's got a strong case as the primary caregiver, especially if she can prove you've been unfaithful. But we can work with this. If you want custody, we'll fight for it. And the house? That's negotiable." "I don't want her to take my kids," I said firmly. "I'm not going to lose them." Mark nodded again, his expression serious. "Then we'll need to be strategic. We'll argue that she's financially dependent on you, that she can't provide the same level of stability. And as for the affair, well, let's just say that's not something we need to highlight." It was a dirty tactic, and I knew it. But I wasn't going to let Laura walk away with everything. If she wanted to play hardball, so would I. Laura, however, had other plans. Her lawyer, Ben, was sharp and methodical, the kind of guy who didn't miss a single detail. I knew I was in trouble the first time I met him in court. He had this quiet confidence, the kind that made you feel like he already knew the outcome before the hearing even started. He didn't waste any time digging into my life. He subpoenaed bank records, work schedules, and even emails. I tried to keep Sophie out of it, but Ben wasn't stupid. He knew exactly where to look, and he found everything. Laura, of course, played the role of the perfect mother in court. She showed up with neatly organized documents, glowing letters from teachers and daycare staff, and even a calendar detailing every doctor's appointment and school event she'd handled on her own. She painted a picture of a woman who had dedicated her entire life to her family while I looked like a man who'd been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. The worst part? She wasn't wrong. I could feel the tide turning against me with every hearing. Ben was relentless, and Laura was unshakable. She didn't cry, didn't lose her temper. She just sat there, calm and composed, while I tried to justify my actions to a judge who clearly wasn't impressed. And then came the bombshell. Ben walked into court one day with a folder in his hand, and a look on his face that made my stomach churn. I didn't know what he had, but I knew it wasn't good. He handed the folder to the judge and began speaking, his voice measured and deliberate. "Your Honor, we've obtained evidence that Mr. Ryan has been involved in unethical practices at his workplace, including the transfer of sensitive company information to a competitor." My heart stopped. "What?" I blurted out, standing up. "That's not true." "Mr. Ryan, sit down," the judge ordered, her tone sharp. Ben continued, laying out every detail with surgical precision. By the time he was done, I felt like the walls were closing in. My lawyer tried to mitigate the damage, but it was too late. The court wasn't just looking at me as a bad husband anymore. They were looking at me as a liar, a cheat, and a man who couldn't be trusted. And Laura? She just sat there, watching it all unfold. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Was it pity? Disappointment? Or was it the quiet satisfaction of a woman who knew she was about to win? I walked into that courtroom feeling like a man walking the plank. I wasn't prepared for the mess I had found myself in. No one could be. My lawyer, Mark, kept telling me to stay calm, but the words barely registered. Laura sat on the other side of the room, her posture straight, her face calm. She didn't even look at me. It was unnerving. I used to know every expression on her face, but now I had no idea what she was thinking. Sophie sat next to me, tapping away on her phone like this wasn't the most important day of my life. I nudged her. Could you at least pretend to care? She sighed, rolling her eyes. I'm here, aren't I? What more do you want? It hit me then that Sophie, for all her flair and drama, wasn't Laura. Laura would have fought for me, stood by me, even if I didn't deserve it. Sophie? She was here for the spectacle. The proceedings started, and I thought I was ready. I wasn't. Laura's lawyer, Ben, didn't waste any time making his case. He laid out every reason why Laura should have full custody of the kids, and why the property should be split equally. I knew it all already, but hearing it in that calm, methodical tone made it feel worse. He painted me as selfish, reckless, and irresponsible, a man who had jeopardized his family's future for his own selfish desires. I wanted to argue, to shout that it wasn't true, but Mark had warned me to keep my mouth shut. So I sat there, seething, while Ben did his job. And then Laura stood up. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady but firm. Before we proceed further, I'd like to request a witness to be brought in. A witness? My heart started racing. Who could she possibly be calling? No one knew me better than Laura, and that made her dangerous. The judge nodded. Proceed. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and in walked Rachel. I froze. My blood turned to ice. Rachel was a secretary at my company, someone who knew things she shouldn't. My heart sank as I realized Laura wasn't just trying to win custody, she was trying to destroy me. Rachel walked to the stand, her expression nervous but determined. After being sworn in, she glanced at me briefly before focusing on the judge. Your Honor, she began, her voice trembling slightly, I'm here to testify about Mr. Ryan's actions at his workplace. My lawyer immediately objected. Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the matter of custody and property division. The judge raised a hand to silence him. I'll allow it. Continue, Ms. Rachel. Rachel took a deep breath. Ryan has been leaking sensitive company information to a competitor. I know this because I was asked to document one of the exchanges. He received significant payments for the data he provided. The room fell silent. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. That's a lie. I shouted, standing up without thinking. Sit down, Mr. Ryan, the judge ordered sharply. Rachel continued. I have emails, financial records, and even audio recordings that prove his involvement. I've submitted copies to the court. Mark leaned over to me, whispering urgently. Ryan, did you do this? I didn't answer. What was the point? It was all over. The judge reviewed the evidence, her expression grim. This is serious, she said, her tone heavy. If these allegations are true, they not only speak to Mr. Ryan's character but may also result in criminal charges. My employer, who had been sitting in the audience, stood up suddenly. Your Honor, I'd like to confirm that we've been investigating this matter internally. We weren't able to identify the source of the leak until now. I'll be pursuing legal action against Mr. Ryan. The judge nodded. Thank you for your statement. Please sit down. I slumped back in my chair, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on me. My career, my reputation, my family, everything I'd worked for was gone. The judge turned to Laura. Do you have any further requests, Mrs. Laura? Laura shook her head. No, Your Honor. I just wanted the truth to come out. The judge called for a recess, and I stumbled out of the courtroom, barely able to stand. Sophie followed me, her heels clicking loudly against the tile floor. What the hell was that? She hissed. I didn't answer. What could I say? She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time, and she didn't like what she saw. I can't believe I got involved with you, she muttered before storming off. I sat down on a bench, my head in my hands. For the first time in my life, I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a way out. Laura had one. And the worst part? I wasn't even mad at her. I didn't think things could get any worse after Rachel walked in and destroyed my reputation in front of everyone, but I underestimated Laura. She wasn't done yet. The hearing resumed after recess, and the air in the courtroom felt heavier than before. Sophie was gone. She hadn't even bothered to come back, which wasn't surprising. I was alone now, facing the fallout of my decisions with nothing but my lawyer and a sinking sense of dread to keep me company. The judge called Rachel back to the stand, and this time, Laura's lawyer, Ben, dug deeper. "Ms. Rachel," Ben began, pacing slowly in front of the stand. "You testified earlier that Mr. Ryan sold company secrets to a competitor. Can you elaborate on how you came to know about these transactions?" Rachel nodded, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "I was asked to document one of the meetings between Mr. Ryan and the representatives from the competing firm. It took place late at night in the office. I recorded the conversation, took notes, and later processed the payment records." "Were these instructions given to you directly by Mr. Ryan?" Ben asked, glancing at me briefly before returning his attention to Rachel. "Yes," she said without hesitation. I wanted to argue, to stand up and shout that it wasn't true, but what was the point? The evidence was airtight, and Rachel wasn't going to back down. Ben leaned against the podium, his tone calm but pointed. "In your professional opinion, Ms. Rachel, did Mr. Ryan's actions pose a significant risk to your company's operations and reputation?" "They did," Rachel replied. "The information he provided was highly sensitive, strategic plans, client data, and internal processes. It gave the competitor a significant advantage and directly impacted our company's performance." The judge scribbled notes while my employer, seated in the back of the room, nodded grimly. "And you're certain that these actions were carried out solely by Mr. Ryan?" Ben pressed. "Yes. He was the only one involved from our side," Rachel confirmed. Ben turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness." The judge gestured for my lawyer to cross-examine, but Mark shook his head. He knew there was nothing he could say that wouldn't make things worse. "Ms. Rachel, you may step down," the judge said, her tone neutral. As Rachel returned to her seat, I felt the last shred of hope I'd been clinging to slip away. The judge turned to Laura. "Mrs. Laura, do you have any additional evidence to present?" Laura stood, her hands clasped in front of her. "No, Your Honor. I believe everything that needed to be said has been said." Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but I could see the fire in her eyes. This wasn't just about winning custody or dividing property. This was about showing everyone, that she wasn't the woman I had underestimated for so long. The judge sighed and leaned back in her chair, glancing between me and Laura. "This is a complicated case," she said. "On one hand, we have the matter of custody and property division. On the other, we have allegations of unethical behavior that could impact Mr. Ryan's ability to provide for his family. I will need time to deliberate." She banged her gavel, signaling the end of the session, and everyone began to file out of the courtroom. I stayed behind, unable to move. Mark sat beside me, his face grim. "Ryan," he said finally, "this isn't good. If your employer decides to press charges, you could be looking at jail time." "I know," I muttered, my voice hollow. "And the judge," he continued, "she's not going to be sympathetic after everything that's come out. You need to prepare yourself for the possibility that you could lose custody, the house, everything." "I know," I said again, though the words felt meaningless. Mark left after a while, muttering something about needing to prepare for the next hearing. I stayed in the empty courtroom, staring at the spot where Rachel had sat. How had it all come to this? When I finally left, the hallways were quiet. Laura was standing near the exit, talking to Ben. She glanced up as I approached, her expression unreadable. "Laura," I began, my voice breaking. She held up a hand, stopping me in my tracks. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't apologize. Don't make excuses. Just don't." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. For what it's worth, I didn't think it would go this far. She laughed bitterly. "That's the problem, Ryan. You didn't think at all." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the weight of my failure. When the judge announced her decision, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the courtroom. I sat there, frozen, as the words hit me like a sledgehammer. Laura had won custody of the kids. She was awarded half of the marital property, including the car she used to shuttle Ivy and Miles around. I was left with the other car and half the house's value, not even the house itself. I should have been angry, but I wasn't. I should have been defiant, ready to appeal, to fight back, but I wasn't. Sitting there, staring at Laura's calm face across the room, I realized that I had lost something far more important than the house or the money. I had lost my family, my identity, and whatever shred of respect Laura might have had left for me. The judge had been firm yet fair in her ruling. "Mr. Ryan," she said, addressing me directly, "the evidence presented today demonstrates that your actions have negatively impacted your family. While this court acknowledges your financial contributions, Mrs. Laura has been the primary caregiver, providing emotional and physical support to your children. It is in their best interest to remain with her as the custodial parent." It was a clean sweep for Laura, but she didn't gloat. She didn't even look at me as she gathered her papers and stood to leave. Ben leaned over to her, whispering something that made her nod slightly, but she kept her face composed. I hated how composed she was. I followed them out of the courtroom, trailing a few steps behind. Sophie hadn't come back, so it was just me, walking through the hallway like a man without a destination. Laura stopped outside, talking quietly to Ben. I stood awkwardly nearby, not sure whether to approach or just keep walking. Eventually, Ben walked away, and Laura turned to face me. "You got what you wanted," I said, my voice harsher than I intended. She raised an eyebrow. "What I wanted was a faithful husband and a stable home for my kids. This isn't what I wanted, Ryan. It's what you forced me to do." Her words stung, but I couldn't argue with them. "Laura," I hesitated, unsure of what I was even trying to say. "I'm sorry. For everything." She let out a soft sigh, her expression softening just a fraction. "I believe you're sorry, Ryan, but sorry doesn't fix this. It doesn't fix what you did to me, to our kids, to yourself." I nodded, unable to meet her eyes. She was right, of course. She always had been. "Look," she continued, her voice steady, "you'll still see Ivy and Miles. That's what matters most now. They need their father, even if—" She trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. "Even if I don't deserve them," I finished for her, the weight of the words sinking into my chest. She didn't confirm or deny it, just gave me a small, tired smile before walking away. I stood there, watching her go, and for the first time, I wondered if I'd ever truly known her. Laura wasn't just the woman who stayed home with the kids, or the wife who kept everything running smoothly. She was strong, resilient, and far braver than I'd ever given her credit for. I drove home alone that day, replaying the events in my mind. The hearing, Rachel's testimony, the judge's ruling. It all felt surreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. The house felt empty when I got there, even though it was still technically mine for the time being. Sophie had texted me once, saying she needed time to think, but I knew what that really meant. She was done with me. Sitting in the living room, surrounded by the remnants of what used to be my life, I realized I had nothing left to fight for. Laura had one, and she deserved to. A week later, I got the paperwork detailing the custody arrangement. I would have visitation rights every other weekend and alternating holidays. It wasn't much, but it was more than I deserved. I'd always been a weekend dad, showing up when it was convenient and leaving the hard work to Laura. Now, I had to prove I could be more than that. Ivy and Miles were hesitant during my first weekend with them. They were polite, but there was a distance I didn't know how to bridge. Ivy spent most of the time reading, and Miles clung to his sister like she was the only stable thing in his world. I tried to engage with them, to make jokes, but they didn't laugh. It was a stark reminder of how much damage I had done. When I dropped them back off at Laura's new apartment, she met me at the door. "How are they?" she asked, her tone neutral. "Quiet," I admitted. "I think they're still adjusting." "They'll come around," she said, her eyes softening slightly. "Just don't push them, Ryan. Let them come to you." I nodded, grateful for her advice, even if I didn't deserve it. "Thanks, Laura, for giving me a chance to, I don't know, make things right." She tilted her head, studying me for a moment before replying. "Ryan, You can't undo what's been done. But if you're serious about being there for the kids, then show them. Actions speak louder than words. I watched her close the door, feeling the weight of her words settle over me. She was right again. Words weren't enough. They never had been. And so, for the first time in a long time, I decided to stop talking and start doing. Losing the custody battle hit me like a freight train. But it wasn't just about the court's decision. It was the weight of everything that came crashing down after. My job, my reputation, Sophie. It all unraveled in what felt like record time. I'd always prided myself on being in control, but now I was spinning out, and there was no way to stop it. Sophie left a week after the court hearing. She didn't even bother with a face-to-face goodbye. Just a single text. This isn't what I signed up for. I can't do this. Take care. That was it. No explanation, no closure. I sat there staring at my phone, trying to feel something. Anger, sadness, regret. But I just felt empty. Maybe I knew deep down that this was coming. She didn't love me. She loved the idea of me. And when that idea shattered, so did her interest. At work, things weren't much better. The CEO called me into his office the day after Rachel's testimony. I walked in knowing exactly what was coming. "Ryan," he began, his tone clipped. "I don't think I need to explain why we're having this conversation." I nodded, swallowing hard. "No, sir." "We trusted you," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "You were in a position of authority, and you exploited it. Do you realize the damage you've done to this company?" "I do," I said, though the words felt hollow. "We can't keep you here," he said firmly. "Effective immediately, your position is terminated. You'll be receiving a severance package, but don't expect it to be generous." I left the building that day with a cardboard box of my belongings and the distinct feeling that I was walking out of my own life. My coworkers didn't say goodbye. They didn't even look at me. I wasn't Ryan, the department head, anymore. I was just the guy who betrayed them. Back home, the house felt even emptier without Sophie. I'd walk from room to room, trying to distract myself with mundane tasks, cleaning, organizing, anything to avoid sitting alone with my thoughts. But the silence was deafening, and no matter how much I tried to push it away, the reality of my situation always came crashing back. Ivy and Miles were the only bright spots in my life, but even that felt tenuous. They were polite when they visited, but the warmth we once had was gone. Ivy would sit in the corner with her books, barely speaking, while Miles clung to her like she was his lifeline. I didn't blame them. I had let them down in ways I couldn't even begin to fix. Laura, of course, was thriving. She'd moved into a cozy apartment with the kids and seemed happier than I'd seen her in years. She didn't flaunt it, but I could see it in her posture, her smile, the way she carried herself. She was rebuilding her life piece by piece, and I was just a spectator on the sidelines. One evening, I decided to call her. It wasn't about the kids or the custody arrangement. I just needed to hear her voice. She answered after a few rings, her tone cautious but polite. "Ryan," she said, "is everything okay?" "I don't know," I admitted. I don't know what to do anymore, Laura. Everything's falling apart." There was a pause, and I could almost hear her debating whether or not to engage. Finally, she sighed. "Ryan, I can't fix this for you. You've made your choices, and now you have to deal with the consequences. But if you're asking for advice, I'll give you some. Stop feeling sorry for yourself and start doing better. Not for me, not for Sophie, for Ivy and Miles. They deserve that much." Her words stung, but they were exactly what I needed to hear. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a strange mix of shame and determination. She was right. I couldn't wallow forever. I had to figure out how to move forward. I started applying for jobs the next day, but the response wasn't encouraging. My reputation in the industry was ruined, and every rejection email felt like another nail in the coffin. I sold my car to cover the bills and started looking for smaller, more affordable places to live. It was humbling in a way I wasn't prepared for. Meanwhile, Laura kept thriving. The kids seemed happier every time I saw them, and while they were still reserved around me, I could tell they felt secure with her. She was doing everything I should have done, and it was both inspiring and infuriating. The turning point came one night when I was scrolling through old photos on my phone. There was one of Ivy and Miles at the park. Their faces lit up with laughter as I pushed them on the swings. It hit me then. I couldn't get those moments back, but I could create new ones. If I wanted to be part of their lives, I had to stop being the man who ruined everything and start being the man they deserved. The next morning, I called Laura. I want to do better, I told her. For Ivy and Miles. I don't know where to start, but I'm willing to try. She didn't respond right away, but when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than I expected. Start by showing up, Ryan. Be consistent. Be present. That's all they need. I didn't know if I could fix everything, but I knew I had to try. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark in the darkness. And that was enough to get me through another day. When Laura agreed to let me try, it was like a lifeline tossed into the storm I'd been drowning in. But she made it clear, this wasn't about me. It was about Ivy and Miles. If I wanted to be part of their lives, I had to prove I could be consistent, trustworthy, and present. No more excuses, no more distractions. The first weekend I had the kids after that conversation was awkward, to say the least. Ivy still kept her distance, buried in her books, and Miles, while a little more open, clung to her like she was his safety net. I didn't push them. Instead, I focused on being there, really being there. I cooked dinner, played board games, and even helped Miles with his art project for school. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Laura noticed the change, though she didn't say much at first. She would smile politely when I dropped the kids off, but there was a guardedness to her that hadn't been there before. I didn't blame her. After everything I'd put her through, she had every right to be cautious. Over time, things started to shift. Ivy began to warm up, slowly but surely. One evening, as I was driving her and Miles back to Laura's apartment, she put her book down and asked, "Dad, why do you always listen to old music in the car?" It was such a small question, but it felt monumental. It was the first time she'd voluntarily spoken to me in weeks. "I guess it reminds me of when I was younger," I said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Why? You don't like it?" "It's okay," she said, shrugging. "I just think it's funny. Mom says you used to make her listen to the same songs when you were dating." That made me laugh. A real, genuine laugh. Yeah, she's right. I guess some things don't change. Ivy smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like her dad again. Miles was easier to win over. He loved anything involving hands-on activities, so I started planning weekends around things we could build or create together. One Saturday, we spent hours constructing a model rocket. When we finally launched it, his face lit up with pure joy. "Did you see that, Dad?" he shouted, jumping up and down. "I saw it, buddy," I said, grinning. "You did a great job." Moments like that reminded me why I was fighting so hard to rebuild my relationship with them. It wasn't about proving anything to Laura or making up for my mistakes. It was about being there for Ivy and Miles, giving them the father they deserved. Laura, too, began to soften. She started inviting me in for a cup of coffee when I dropped the kids off, and we'd talk. Nothing deep, just the kind of small talk we used to take for granted. She'd tell me about Ivy's latest obsession with fantasy novels, or Miles's newfound love for soccer. I'd listen, grateful for the chance to be part of their world again, even in small ways. One day, as we sat at her kitchen table, she said something that caught me off guard. "You're doing better, Ryan," she said, her voice thoughtful. "The kids are happier. They talk about you a lot more now." "Thanks," I said, unsure of how to respond. "That means a lot." She nodded, sipping her coffee. "It's not just about them, though. You seem different, calmer, more grounded." I shrugged, looking down at my hands. I guess I've had a lot of time to think about what matters. And I realized I was chasing all the wrong things. Laura didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes told me she understood. Over time, we started working together more as co-parents. We planned birthdays, school events, and holiday schedules without the tension that used to hang over every interaction. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of awkwardness, still unspoken wounds that hadn't fully healed, but we were making progress. As for me, I found a new job, not as glamorous as my old one, but it was steady and honest work. I rented a modest apartment closer to Laura's place so I could be more involved in the kids' lives. It wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself, but it was a life I could be proud of. One evening, after I dropped the kids off, Laura stopped me at the door. "Ryan," she said, hesitating for a moment, "I just want you to know, I'm proud of you. For stepping up. For trying." Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. "Thanks," I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot coming from you." She smiled, a real, genuine smile, and for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just a failure in her eyes. Life wasn't perfect, but it was better. I was better. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally on the right path. It was a quiet afternoon when I saw Laura again. Outside the usual exchanges with the kids. I hadn't planned it. I was at a small cafe downtown, sipping a coffee while trying to map out my next steps in life. She walked in, her presence as steady and self-assured as ever. She looked around, spotted me, and hesitated. For a moment, I thought she might turn around and leave, but instead, she walked over to my table. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her tone neutral but polite. "Of course," I said, gesturing to the seat across from me. I wasn't sure if I should be nervous or relieved. She sat down, placed her bag on the floor, and folded her hands on the table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It felt strange, sitting there with her, like we were two strangers trying to reconnect after years apart. In a way, that's exactly what we were. "How've you been?" she asked, breaking the silence. I shrugged. "Not great, if I'm being honest. Work's been challenging. Sophie left. I'm still figuring things out." Laura nodded, her expression unreadable. "I heard you sold the house." "Yeah," I said, my voice quieter now. It didn't feel like home anymore. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in years, I felt like she wasn't angry or disappointed. She was just, "Laura, I'm glad you're trying," she said softly. "For Ivy and Miles. They need you, Ryan. And it seems like you're finally stepping up." Her words hit me harder than I expected. "I'm trying," I said, my voice almost a whisper. "I know it doesn't make up for everything, but I want to be better for them. And for myself." We talked for a while after that, reminiscing about the good times. Those rare, golden moments before everything fell apart. It was bittersweet, but it felt necessary, like we were both finally letting go of the anger and resentment that had defined our relationship for so long. Before we parted ways, Laura said something I'll never forget. "You weren't all bad, Ryan. We had good moments, too. And I hope you find happiness again, wherever that might be." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "You too, Laura. You deserve it." Life moved forward after that. Laura and I fell into a comfortable rhythm as co-parents, working together to make sure Ivy and Miles had everything they needed. The kids started smiling more, laughing more, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was part of their lives again. Laura moved into a new home, a cozy apartment that suited her and the kids perfectly. She invited me over one day to see it, and I couldn't help but smile at how warm and welcoming it felt. There were pictures of Ivy and Miles on the walls, their artwork scattered around the living room. It was clear they were happy here, and that was all that mattered. As for me, I found a small apartment of my own. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it was a start. I decorated it with a few pieces of furniture, some books, and a handful of photos of Ivy and Miles. It wasn't home in the way the old house had been, but it felt right for this new chapter of my life. One day, Ivy asked me if I was happy. We were sitting in the park, watching Miles climb a jungle gym. Her question caught me off guard, but I didn't hesitate to answer. "I think I'm getting there," I said. "It's a process, but I'm working on it." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that reminded me why I was trying so hard. "I think you'll get there, Dad," she said. "You're doing better." Those words stayed with me long after the day ended. Laura, too, was moving forward. I heard from the kids that she'd started dating again, and while it stung at first, I knew it was what she deserved. She deserved someone who could give her the stability and love I hadn't. When I finally met her boyfriend, he was kind and respectful, and I could see the way Laura's eyes lit up when she talked about him. It was clear she was happy, and that was all I wanted for her. As for me, I didn't rush into anything. My focus remained on Ivy and Miles, on rebuilding my life and becoming the kind of father they could be proud of. Slowly but surely, things began to fall into place. Months later, Laura and I found ourselves sitting together at Ivy's school play. We laughed and cheered as she performed, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were a team again. Not as husband and wife, but as parents. After the play, as we stood outside waiting for Ivy and Miles, Laura turned to me. "You've come a long way, Ryan," she said, her voice soft. "I'm proud of you." "Thanks, Laura," I said, and for the first time, I truly believed I deserved her words. Our journey wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And in the end, we both found what we needed: closure, growth, and a new beginning for ourselves and our family.